My name is Latasha Gillespie, and I lead the Global Diversity and Inclusion Organization at Amazon. And I want to welcome you to the first ever diversity series at reInvent. So we have an exciting lineup over the next 2 days, and we hope that you will join all or as many of the sessions as you can. Today we'll be kicking off with a panel on gender identity, followed by a session on bridging the racial digital divide. Diversity lightning talks will follow that. This evening we will have an inclusion happy hour that we encourage all of you to come out to and invite a friend, and then come back tomorrow for our wrap-up session on She Powers Tech tomorrow afternoon. I hope all of you are going to plan to come to those. We know that our collective backgrounds, our racial identity, our gender identity, gender expression, all the things that make up who we are, collectively help us innovate, help us make breakthroughs in technology, because collectively, we power tech. We Power Tech is not just what we do, but it's also a movement. We Power Tech is helping build skills and networks for our underrepresented communities in technology. And so I want to encourage all of you, share your story, share your insights, post on Twitter or whatever social media you use with the hashtag WePowerTech. So today, I am really excited about kicking off a panel where we can talk about how tech leaders can help build work environments where all employees can bring their whole selves to work. This illustrious panel I have is going to talk about gender identity and strategies for how we all can contribute to creating an inclusive and highly functional team in our own workplaces. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. If you would help me give a round of applause to Amelie Karan, Dom de Guzman, Erica Windish, Yakaru Dizaki. And I'm going to let my panel introduce themselves in just a moment, but I also wanted to bring to your attention that AWS is very keen on training both this generation as well as the next generation, and also anyone who is thinking about or in the process of doing a career change on opportunities with cloud computing. In order to make it easier for you to get training, our AWS training and certification team launched free, can you say free? Free digital training yesterday to enable you to build skills and learn more about AWS. They also announced an AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner, a new entry-level certification that enables individuals with an overall understanding of the cloud to validate their knowledge. And because you are participating in the diversity series, you are eligible and are offered a free AWS certification exam. Right. So we just encourage you, look out for an email from AWS Training and Certification about those details. So again, today's first panel is talking about gender identity. And when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about a person's internal, deeply felt sense of being masculine, feminine, non-binary, regardless of the sex they were assigned at birth. So with that, I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about who they are, what they do, and their pronoun.
Hi, I'm Yakaru Dizaki, and I'm non-binary and intersex, and I will actually accept any pronouns. I work at Amazon Game Studios, and I've been in the game industry for about 15 years, including titles like Gears of War and League of Legends, but been at Amazon for about the last 2 years.
Erica Windish. I'm the CTO and co-founder of IOPipe. We provide observability into Amazon Lambda. I've been doing that for 2 years. I was formerly at Docker. Just been in tech and doing like hosting and cloud services stuff for like 15 years. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Dom. I work for a company called Twilio. I'm a engineer there. I've done most of the roles in platform engineering, and now I lead up a program for operational and engineering maturity. Maybe masculine of center, but I am cis female, so I use she, her pronouns.
Amelie Karan. I'm the Deputy CIO of the Health and Human Services Department for the federal government and under the Office of the Inspector General. Pronouns she, her. And I've been in tech longer than I can actually count at this point. I think it goes back to, we were talking computers earlier, like which was your first. But I've been working in academia, private, public sector, anywhere from working at the White House to my current agency. Did some time at Disney. Wait, that sounded wrong. But anyhow, and also got a chance to work for my alma mater many years later. It was an interesting experience to go back and try to help in a different perspective. So, yeah, here we go.
Fantastic. Now, audience, first question is actually to you. By show of hands, how many of you feel like you're an expert on gender identity and gender expression? What? Nobody that wants to? Oh, one that could join the panel. Okay. How many of you are here because you're really interested in learning more about gender? Awesome. Fantastic.
Whoa.
Yeah. So don't depend on me for that. So as a cisgen woman, I'm here to actually learn as much as you are, and I'm so excited to have this panel here to help educate us all and what we can do in our part to make our work environments more inclusive for everyone. So the first question I want to start off, Yakaro, with you is, and anybody else can jump in, how do we help people just ground them in terminologies? A lot of people don't know what's the right thing to say. They don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah, sure. So it is one of those fields where, especially if you kind of wander into the right part of the internet, you can get incredibly specific. There are lots of very kind of drilled down terms, but I think most people can do really well if they just kind of keep a few basic things in mind. You covered, kind of the definition of gender at the opening, which is internal and deeply felt. A lot of people cross that with what you might call gender expression, which is more social. Example, men wore high heels in the 1700s. It was considered masculine then, it's not considered that now. Versus sex, which is assigned at birth, and then there's sexual orientation, which is who you're attracted to. Those are all roughly independent things. They can all differ a little bit. And I think just being able to track those things gets you a lot of the way there. There's a couple of words. A lot of people have been hearing cis recently and don't really know the origin. It basically means on the same side. It means your gender and sex are in alignment. That is not an invented word. If you've followed nutrition, you might have heard of trans fats. Well, they're opposed by cis fats, and so you can be transgender or cisgender. That's all it means. It's on the same side or on the other side. And so, in the same way, like, I'm intersex, which means I have a mixture biologically of male and female traits. I happen to also be non-binary, but those are different things that are, for example, commonly confused. And so that's kind of the starting point. And then, obviously there's things like pronoun etiquette and things like that, which I think some other panel members might be able to talk about. Oh, sure. Leave me hanging. All right. I can do it.
I was going to say, we had a small chat before this, was the etiquette aspect of, many years ago, and as I talk about how old I am, you never kind of started out a conference with sensitivity of like what your gender identity was, so no one asked your pronouns and so forth, and now as we've become, I guess, either more aware or in certain factions of the community will say, like, we've become oversensitized. And I think that's been a big change, is you got a plus and a minus to each one of those cases. As people become more aware, they're also more sensitive to being told what they should and shouldn't be doing.
No, absolutely. One of the internal kind of debates, as you might have noticed when we opened, she asked us to give our pronouns, and I've actually seen some people in the community be very nervous about that, because if somebody's questioning or not quite ready to talk about, how they feel about that kind of thing, it can put them on the spot. But on the other hand, if you don't give them that opportunity and then they're, addressed with the wrong pronouns, it could cause issues there. So it's actually not this super straightforward thing in a lot of ways.
I mean, I have to say, even answering my own question, like what is your name, has been a tricky question for me sometimes. Not so much anymore, but like when I was first questioning, when I was first coming out, that was like a really hard question to answer. What is your name?
How did you answer?
Dependent on the context.
Fair enough, fair enough. So I'm sure you are sitting out there with your own set of questions. We're going to have an opportunity at the latter part of today's sessions for audience members to ask questions. Our panelists are very open, as you can tell, and are willing to address any questions you may have, as you were looking at what you can do to personally help build an inclusive work environment. All right, so Erica, I want to talk to you for a second because I know you've done some work in the community around this space of safety. And there's been a lot in the news recently about particularly safety issues around women with a lot of the recent things that have been going on, but not as much around safety in the trans community.
Yeah, so, well, and it's actually interesting because are we still in November or is this December? I can't even tell anymore.
We're still in
It's
November
still
for a couple
November.
days.
Yeah, so
It's also still 2017.
yeah. Oh, God. Yeah, so this is like the Trans Month of Visibility, and we had the Transgender Remembrance Day. And, so like there are these events, to try and raise some visibility in the fact that the murder of transgender people, especially transgender women, and even more especially transgender women of color, is very high. And 2017 has been, the year of the most deaths and murders of, transgender women, especially those of color, that we know of, that we've recorded. And so like the problem's not getting better. It's really hard for me to say like, oh, here's a solution, right? Like, it's never that way with almost anything. But we need to know it's a problem and we need to work on it. And it's really hard too because a lot of people in the trans community have issues with the fact like of increased visibility, right? Because sometimes we feel, at least sometimes I feel, and sometimes some of my friends I know they've expressed that they feel this way. I can't speak for the other panelists, but that that visibility, it can have a dual-edged sword, right? Because now we're like fighting for our safety, our ability to go to the bathroom in certain states. We're fighting, all these battles on all these fronts that we were accepted only because we were ignored, and now, like that attention. There's positive and negative attention, so it's really hard to really say like I have a solution to this. I do think that something that people can do is yes, do be aware and maybe can if you're transgender consider if you have the ability to be involved in community stuff. If you're cisgender. See how you can help, your local LGBT organizations, your community centers, even if that's just financial support or if that's donations, whatever, donating clothes, whatever it is, because those things really help, like on, those small scale things do add up.
So physical safety is, important, right? But Dom, I want to come to you for a second because emotional safety is equally important. And so what should we be thinking about in our companies, and maybe what are you doing in your organization to help make sure that we're creating emotionally safe environments as well as physically safe environments for our trans community?
I think one of the most important things is to make sure that you create space for everyone. And that includes making space for people to understand that there are issues that need to be brought up and that we need to make a safe space for them to be able to do so, which also means that you should be listening and not immediately trying to come up with a solution, because sometimes it's not the solution that needs to be heard first. I think another thing is that, I really want to say this eloquently, but we are not Google. So I wouldn't continuously ask the same person that who is out whether or not something is appropriate or whether or not something you can say these things or should we do these things? Can you be the advocate for this? It's really difficult if someone comes to you and you're the only out person and they're like, "What would you like to do for World Coming Out Day?" You're like, "I don't know."
Pizza.
Honestly, you could probably come back and be like, we really deserve the day off. It's just celebrate.
Paid, of course.
I honestly think that it really comes down to creating that safe space and being able to have, being able to understand what it means to be an ally in those safe spaces, and then having that allyship kind of not just stay at one level, but be bled through the entire organization. So that if somebody doesn't feel comfortable, or if someone has an idea, or someone wants to make change, that it doesn't stop at just their desk mate, and it doesn't stop at just their ERGs, but it does elevate into meetings that they're not invited to, or into budget meetings where they may not have any visibility into. It takes allies and advocates all over.
Yeah, so that, you want to jump in on that? I was just about to ask you, because allyship, a lot of people think it's kind of a passive thing.
I was actually going to build on what was mentioned, because I'm kind of looking at this from also the other perspective. So as we mentioned about like safe spaces, and sometimes that's a trigger word, I'm sure, if you follow a certain side of politics, you hear the term snowflake or safe spaces and stuff, and I think a lot of that kind of gets riled up because people think that as you're creating space, you're taking other spaces away from somebody else. And that's a reason for them to get riled up about. So I think also as allyship, or just when you look at it in your organization, is to understand that you're not taking something to create something, you're just defining that area. So it's still there, but you're not, no one's losing out in this case.
Yeah. So do one of you want to touch on, though, what does allyship and advocacy look like in action versus just being kind of a passive ally? And in theory, yes, of course, I support. But what does that look like in action?
I mean, honestly, sometimes I wish my allies would just be quiet.
That's fair.
But no, it's a thing where, like, just coming here to reInvent, I got in a lift on the way to the airport, and less than a minute into my car, my driver was telling me all about her, her friend who is trans, and she's going to her house like right after like dropping me off. I'm like, so I guess you clocked me. Thank you. And I get that a lot. Like, I get people like, oh, hi, it's nice to meet you. Let me tell you all about my trans friend. And, oh, by the way, like, her dead name, which is the, the name that somebody was known as before they were, they changed their name. And they'll tell you that. And then they'll show you before and after pictures. And like, isn't she sexy? And it's like, I know you're really trying to be a good ally because you see yourself as supportive. But, like, yeah, they could use some work.
But remember, we have a mafia because we've been told every trans person is supposed to know the other trans person they're talking about.
That's the same with black people, too.
So that's our agenda.
Yeah, we get that in the black community a lot. Don't you know such and such? Not really.
Lesbians too. We've all dated each other. It's fine.
There's one U-Haul and a Subaru counted for all of us.
Okay, Yukaru, help us, because the audience is like, okay, well then what do I do?
Right. So one of the ways I like to put this that kind of goes back to that is, if you've got an unusual gender identity, you also have a lot of other identity, whether you're an ally or, hopefully no opponents in here, but it's, like there was a transgender politician running, and that became the whole campaign. She had a platform, but the whole thing was just about this trans person running, or, oh, I've got a trans, and it's like, we have other interests. We are real people. And so part of being allies is accepting us as people, and, treating us as individuals. And I also think there's just a big part of, for me, I kind of made the decision to become very open about my identity because I don't want to be Google, but it's, I like, being able to educate and stand up and be this visible person, because if I didn't, then, there's a term in the trans community in specific called stealth, which is where you've transitioned and you look, the gender, no one questions it, and then you become invisible, and then there becomes this problem of, fear for most people, it's of the unknown. So you start hearing about the transgender bathroom bills, and it's these people who are imagining this, like, giant guy with a beard in a woman's restroom, and it's like, if you pass this bill, you're going to get trans men who look like that in that restroom, and it's, you probably know trans women, and they use the women's restroom, and, I definitely understand, especially with all the, violence recently, why an individual might want to be that stealth thing, but for me, that's why I decided to be open, and so as an ally, I think it's kind of the same thing. If you humanize trans people, if you say, I know them, they're my friends, you can help people realize these are normal people, not these weird monsters that they're made out to be, that only care about using the other gender's restroom even though it's their gender.
I keep asking, how do you know who's in the stall next to you anyway? Okay. Now
You only find out when they ask for toilet paper because it's usually the stuff that disappears the quickest.
This is true. This is true. So you talked about being open and being transparent and out to help educate people. Did you choose to be, or were you outed?
It was kind of a weird mix. So I'll actually kind of go in reverse. So Intersex Awareness Day was last month, and kind of at the same time internally at Amazon, we had a gender identity panel, I want to say a week or two before that. And for the first time, I had members of my team basically saying, oh, what are your pronouns? And I'm sitting here going, I've been here a year and a half. Trust me, if I had a problem with the pronouns you were using, you would have heard about it. But that was this kind of weird, like, even I thought I was very open and realized that people didn't even realize it. But for me, what ended up happening was, I would have these communities where I would basically get identified male, and I'd kind of, okay, fine, if you want to treat me that way, I'm non-binary and I'm okay that way, so I'll go that way. And then in other communities, I would, be gendered female, fine, I like it that way. And then kind of what started happening was two things. One, trans visibility started to become a big thing. And then two, I started having these communities start meeting each other and getting into fights. And like they were sitting here trying to like defend me, and I'm sitting here like, it's fine, guys. And no, you need to tell them they're wrong. No, you need to tell them they're right. And so there was this point where I finally basically decided, screw it, I'll just be very, very open about it so that this doesn't happen again. But I made that choice very deliberately, and it's worked out really well, actually, so I'm pretty happy with it.
What about anybody else in the panel? Want to share
Well, I'm trying to remember what the question was.
the
too.
question about?
Yeah, it was a while.
I ramble.
So,
Did you choose to be open and transparent, or were you outed?
for me, it was a kind of a difficult thing. Just mainly, like when I transitioned at my original agency, it was a big to-do because I was at headquarters. So I was like the highest level official that had transitioned. So at least within that agency, it was kind of like a known secret, like an open secret. And then as I moved on for a rotation at the White House, I kind of got into this rotation on merit. At least I thought so. So
sorry,
I didn't want to be the token
I'm sorry, a rotation where?
at the White House.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I was the first civilian trans person to work at the White House as a federal employee. Yeah, under Obama, yeah. Definitely not now. Yeah, DC, we have our heads so low, we're like looking like ostriches. But so I worked for the federal CIO, and I was, as you were talking about, plain stealth. I call it plain stealth because obviously I got clocked by my boss's wife at a party, and I was like, oh shit, pardon the French, and so it wasn't really kind of a big issue. Of course, her response was, it's okay, we're from Seattle. We're here to help. But generally, it was more or less that I didn't want to make it an issue. But as things, kind of came out, there was another individual who was appointed before Obama left office, and there was a big to-do. And a lot of us who'd kind of there was an intern and myself who'd served before, and we're like, well, let's set the record straight. So we kind of came out willingly to say, like, you weren't the first, but we're glad you're here. But it was a self-decision to do stealth. And I left the federal government. I went to go work for Disney, and I really was kind of like, let's try to play the stealth card here. And did fine, except I got into the advocacy role. So I kind of outed myself willingly to say, hey, there could be a lot more stuff you can do. So there are times and places where you want to do that. And most recently was I had gotten an award for cybersecurity women. And the interview ended up being all about like being trans. And I'm thinking about, there's, God, I can't remember her name now. I have her name, I just can't remember. She was a trans woman, a young trans woman in Ohio who had committed suicide because of her parents and her community. And I was born just south of there. And for me, it was to be out and open and be a mentor and being visible so that we don't have people who lose hope. that is the biggest thing, is I want younger individuals to realize that you can be successful, you can be a leader, you can do your job, do anything you want, and don't let your gender identity, your sexuality, or anything keep you from ever dreaming big.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah. I mean, I also decided to be out and open, and I mean, I had a career already. I had worked at a couple, good companies, startups, and I didn't want to lose that on my resume. I, was in the middle of founding a startup. I had, already started this business that I'm founding and running now. It seemed impossible to not be out and open. But there was definitely like a period of time where I wasn't yet out, right? Like where I was out to, my co-founder, and out to, a couple, like one or two of my employees, and it was like an awkward thing where some of my employees knew and some of them didn't. But I also had a couple times when like I was out at when I didn't want to be outed, right? And it was a problem. One time, actually, I outed myself by accident. I was just talking to like another trans person, and like I was asked my name, and I was like, Erica, and they looked at me like, okay, and I was like, oh, and. But I also had a case where I had submitted a support ticket to a company, and I believe that somebody at the company happened to work as an advisor to a VC and outed me to the VC and caused some issues before I was ready to come out. So, that was like one of these things where, I mean, I can't like say, oh, there was definitely, some sort of discrimination, but it was definitely like suspected discrimination, as well as like a very much potentially unwilling being outed. And I don't know, but I mean, coming out was the thing that like I was going to do. And the only other thing was I actually had one employee who figured it out but never said anything. And I came out and he was like, oh yeah, I already saw that you had that email alias. And I just never said anything.
So I'm curious, so you talked about the VC issue. Did you lose funding as a result of?
We made it okay.
Okay. All right, good. If so, their loss.
Yeah, I mean, well, the other thing was like I talked to my co-founder and we're like, we don't want to work with people that aren't going to work with us. If they can't accept me, then like those aren't the kind of people that we want to work with. And it was also like another thing about being out was like, in some ways it's a pretty good filter for like, who I want to know and be friends with. Because I lost some friends when I came out, and you know what? I'm happy that I lost those people, because like those are not the people I want to be friends with if I lose them because I come out.
And I think that's a nugget for all of us in the room in terms of creating the kind of environments and communities within our organization where everyone feels like they belong and they feel like that people they care about belong there as well. So I think that's really important. You touched on this just a bit, Amelie, about being the first. And
I was setting up my question, so yeah.
so how have you used that to your advantage to kind of blaze trails in this space in your organization? And Dom, I'd like to hear from you on this question as well.
Yeah, so for me, as I'm finding out, as I've worked my way up into executive leadership in the federal government, is a lot of times even at conferences and roundtables or just operating within the agencies or across government, I'm usually the only person of my type at the table. Either I'm the only one feminine identified, especially like we're talking tech, and as you can note, pardon my term here, the sausage fest that is AWS. Then I'm also usually, okay, well, you're female, well, then I'm probably the only LGBTQ person there, so I take that perspective, and then I'm neuroatypical, so I've got touches of Asperger's and depression and all this other stuff. So I'm bringing like all these colors to the discussion, and it's one of those cases of me understanding that I'm there. I'm the only one potentially representing these various circles within the room, and to ensure those voices are heard. I'm not saying that I'm the perfect speaker for any of them, but I'm there. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the questions, to say something, just to get that discussion going. Because for me, it's like typically the worst question the worst question ever is the one that's not asked. So if you get into those spaces and you're not asking the questions, you're not going to get an answer. It could be one that you don't want, but at least you're getting somebody to spend some of that cycles in their gray matter to actually work through giving you an answer. It's not something they'll necessarily hold themselves to, but it's one of those cases where at least it's out there and in the open. It's basically you're outing yourself as something to get something a little bit back, so it's a trade-off. But in other cases, you're asking too. I think it was a part of the follow-up question. So for me, at my agency, when I came out, there was really no policy. In the federal government, they had just announced a policy to how to transition your personnel file. But there was very few, if any, how to handle trans and non-binary people within the federal government for employee, like anything regarding their dress and uniforms. So like we had that with Interior, so you have your Park Service uniforms. The bathroom question, treating for medical care, pronouns, everything. So I was lucky enough to be invited to HR to go and help develop that, and we managed to release that as part of as a chapter within the actual operating manual for the Department of Interior. So that's enshrined in how the government works now. And if you don't take that opportunity to be kind of your own self-advocate, it's basically you don't get a chance to kind of pay it forward. So I think that's the important part, that if you're there as, I hate to say token, but if you're there as yourself, it's kind of your duty, at least in this time and age, to basically try to basically pass the torch forward.
That's awesome. Dom, what about some of the work you've been doing?
I feel very similar, where I've very often found myself to be the only in the room, whether it was all of my identities in that case. But I think that there's a difference between wanting to be that advocate and finding that to be too much of a burden. And I think that it's great when we want to be that person that wants to help educate, but it also takes a huge toll. And a lot of the times, that toll becomes a second job and even takes up more time than your actual job. I started and led up the Diversity and Inclusion Project at Twilio since I started in 2013. I thought it was just like a long email, and it wasn't.
I know the feel.
Yeah.
I know the feel.
Just, it was different, and now it's 4 years later, and it's still an ongoing job. It's something that now a whole other department has, which started off as an email. And I think that one of the things that is really interesting about being an only is realizing that you're not the only one, right? So everybody else feels like an only in their own way, and when you come out and say like, I'm the only one with this, like there are a lot of things that make people an only that you don't see, right? Somebody who is the first in their family to graduate from college, someone who's the first to be, the first to be in tech, or the first to have to take care of their family. Everybody has a different identity, and a lot of decisions made don't always take those into account. Like a very simple one is, why schedule a meeting at 5:30 at night? Like people have families to come home to, and even if they don't have families, they have other places to be. And then there's the other side of this, which is a little bit more cynical on my end, where people recognize that you're an only, and they really want to find absolutely anything to connect with you, but they do it in a really inappropriate way. Like, I do not hide that I am a lesbian. It's not something I hide. But coming up to me and talking about how you've dated a bi girl one time is not how we connect. We have all done that, yes. But it's different. I think that sometimes people try to connect so hard that they just find the one thing that they can see about you and think, this is what I'm going to know about you, and I'm going to ignore everything else because now I have a connection. Now you can push my ticket through. Now I can go to you for a code review. Now I can do these things because I'm cool that you're gay. Right? So there's just this balance of being that only, and then I guess my big takeaway here is that when you're an only, it is a big burden sometimes, and recognizing when you're an only and that it is a burden means that you have to take time for yourself. And it does mean to sometimes tell somebody to push back a little bit.
So I hope you caught those two other nuggets in that. So, one, make sure that as an ally and advocate, you do your own homework. Fair?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Google's awesome.
I was
So-
gonna say this is why at work and some of my coworkers or in and around is like they know me as the geek for everything else. So it's like, hey, let's connect on Lego or Star Wars or movies or comic books. Cool that they don't ask about the LGBT stuff. I'm like, when that's like the 10th question down, I'm totally cool with that.
So do your own homework and then also just treat people like human beings, right? Just connect on a personal level. Awesome. Now, Yukaro, this is a tech conference, as referenced by the sausage making or the sausage comment earlier. And you are particularly in the gaming side of it.
Yes.
Often known as the cave for programmers.
Yeah, a little bit.
Right. And as an intersex person, you sometimes present masculine, you sometimes present feminine. So I imagine that sometimes that can be both a privilege and other times it can be a bit of a tax.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Oh, yeah. So I get to be a fly on the wall in a lot of ways. Many people probably can't. There's a very common narrative if you go and read about people who transition in either direction about, gendered behavior, and it's if you ever hear, debates about are men and women treated equally, go ask some trans people, and you'll hear how they got, how they got treated by basically strangers, and it shifts rather drastically. And I, of course, go back and forth, so I get to see it sometimes on a daily basis. So I've seen some really ridiculous things. I was once in a meeting reviewing some art and for a character, and somebody in there basically looked, I was presenting masculine, and basically said, I think we should redo this because it's a girl character, and I don't want a girl who, like, a 14-year-old wouldn't want to sleep with. And I'm sitting here going, awesome. Like, now I've got to figure out what to say and how, because, it's a very common trope of that people hear about, step up and say something, but it's also, I don't want to be the only one who does, because then I become the problem child. So it is kind of an interesting challenge in that regard. It's also just very fascinating, just day-to-day treatment. If somebody's walking through, getting a tour, you can always tell, I can normally tell how they've gendered me within seconds just by body language, and it's pretty fascinating. So it's kind of been an experience in that way.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. When people read you as feminine, they tend to be a little more emotionally open. Like, their body language tends to be a little more opening. They're much more willing to touch you, whether you want them to or not. Pros and cons. Yeah.
We're starting to learn that's a problem in
yeah.
society.
Yeah.
Hashtag me too, right?
With if I'm read as masculine, it tends to be a little more closed off. It tends to be, no matter what the conversation is, it's less emotional. It's much more technical. The things they'll ask you about, like, hi, how are you? Like, if you're read as feminine, they ask you about hobbies and interests. If you're a guy, they ask you what you do. So it's kind of fascinating in that way. So yeah, it's kind of a trip.
Yeah, I'm curious, Erica, if you've had similar experiences, but before you answer, I want to just remind you that if you have questions for our panelists, if you could just make your way to the aisles, we'll give you a mic so that you can ask your question. Again, there's no bad question. We want all questions, so if you do, just make your ways to the aisle and we'll get a mic to you right away.
Now I forget the question.
So, having both experiences of presenting both masculine and feminine, I'm sure it's probably been a little bit of a privilege and a tax. And just how have you experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think, especially people who are trans, like, have experienced both sides of it, right? And the way that you're treated is just different, and yeah, I don't know. Not a lot of things are coming to mind. Well, one thing is that, as Damas, you were saying about, being an only. And one thing that was that I for a long time thought that I was an only. I didn't realize how many other people were trans. Like, I literally thought it was like 5 people in the world. and like I couldn't come out because like it wasn't like in the 90s, like, you know, the representation was just so horrendous. Like Ace Ventura, like the scenes in that were just horrific. And Silence of the Lambs. I mean, like, actually, like, because I read the book, and like I was actually kind of excited because like, oh, I mean, this person's a horrible monster, but there's somebody that's also a little bit kind of like me. And like, that was like my closest thing to a role model growing up, right? And that's like really horrific. So yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I want to say like I grew up, like I got to see both sides. I got to see what the world was like, you know, perceived as a man, right? And this idea of like, you know, maybe passing privilege as a man, but not actually one. And now being perceived as a woman, but also this actual reality of, you know, this unique experience of like, I didn't have those role models, right? Like I couldn't look at men and say, that male person is my role model, I want to strive to be like him. And I couldn't necessarily strive to be like cis women. I mean, a little bit, but also I knew that I wasn't a cis woman, right? That I'd be a trans woman, and there was just no representation for me. So, I mean, yeah, it's just, it sucks.
I was going to say, is like, you were talking about when we get questions and stuff, we become the Google. The kind of thing that I've experienced, at least with this, is that I get more questions, but it's usually about my abilities. Like, I haven't changed. I'm still the tech nerd geek person, but the decisions I make or things I suggest get questioned more. And that's more just the straight gender side of things. It's not the whole LGBT thing. So on the perspective of at least on transition, it's like, you're kind of, not I'd say gaslit, but you're gaslit into questioning yourself more. And for me, that's allowed me to gain more empathy for cisgendered women, to understand that, you know, while I had, as we refer to as that male privilege, you end up losing it, and you start to really understand the differences and the complications with gender, and specifically in tech. I'm sure it kind of varies in other industries and other areas that people work in, but specifically here, it is just like, you know, are you really sure of that? And they'll take it back to a committee of 12 men when there's a really smart woman in the room, and somehow those 12 men will totally overrule that really good idea. So, yeah, and that's, yeah, that's the least one thing I know I've definitely experienced.
Powerful. Isn't that too why it's so important to get together in forums like this, another where you're not the only one? To me, I think in the diversity space, right, like sometimes I say the unicorns have to get together to remind themselves that they're not actually unicorns, right? That there are people like me who exist in the world. So this is awesome. Okay, we'll take a question over here, and then we'll come to that side.
Sure. I have a question about Dominique's Sausage Fest and Yakuro's Problem Child, because when I come to a talk like this, I feel like I'm in a certain kind of space, like maybe not a safe space, but a space where I can actually talk about diversity stuff and it makes sense. And I don't just mean like gender identity stuff, but being a woman in tech or being queer. And then when I go back to work, I don't feel like I'm in that space. And it really frustrates me. But now I'm starting to get into management, and I have some influence, and I can make a team under me that kind of feels like this space again. But I have no idea how to go outside of this space that I have some control over and extend that space into the rest of my company, or say into every other session that I go to at reInvent. So I'm wondering if you guys have some suggestions or tips or ideas on how to do that.
That's a big one.
Okay, I think you just identified the Sausage Fest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make the quick and pass it. So about building diverse teams. So like as I've worked up through management, as you're talking about, as you progress through your career, you get into a point where you're in a hiring role. And you know, unfortunately, the interesting thing about the federal government is that it's supposed to be basically skills-based. So you're kind of should be blind to the kind of people you're hiring. You're just looking at the skills and trying to hire that way. I've been lucky, at least when I've been in a role where I've set up a hiring environment, is that I'm strictly trying to avoid looking at the names and things like that, and try to look at skills. As I mentioned before, it was like trying to get around the tokenism. It's like you want to be inclusive, you want to kind of build something you're comfortable with, but then if you make the wrong decision, people's feelings get hurt, and it's difficult to kind of justify like recreating that kind of space. I mean, you can build as you know, just your own queer tech company too, but you also lose out the other voices that typically also tend now to dominate that environment. So you have, cis voices or male voices or whatever that are particularly dominant in that area. So if you don't kind of create an environment that is truly, truly diverse, then you're going to run the risk of just basically not getting the best.
I got one.
Oh,
Good.
cool. They got one there.
How did we get an extra one?
I don't know. It's a magic microphone.
Yeah.
Were you gonna?
One thing that okay, I'm just gonna say it. One thing that I did is I was one of the first female engineers at Twilio. So I was very used to being the only and not understanding what that space was like. And now I'm really happy to say that I'm on an all-female engineering team at Twilio. That's really cool. And one of the things that we thank you. One of the things that I learned was that I was very fortunate to have people of color on my team and people with different identities on my team. And we came up with a rule that everyone got to choose a rule for that particular meeting. And one of them was like 1 and 3 and 3 and 1. So if you've spoken 3 times in a meeting, then take a step back. If you haven't, we'll give you the space to speak. And it was something along the lines of not everyone has English as a first language. We speak really fast. We will often speak over somebody else. My favorite rule was the no Kanye rule. Don't cut somebody off. And everybody in your meetings gets to go into other meetings, and they if they like your rule, they bring it up, and they bring it to other meetings, and it just kind of escalates up. And slowly but surely, the culture changes. It's not necessarily going to happen overnight, but you'll start seeing that your rules are being implemented in meetings that you're now invited to.
It's a great one. You, Carol?
So this is kind of to build on that in a slightly different way, more about if you can get a team going like that. One of the things that I think is really important that I was thinking earlier was, being gender diverse or being racially diverse or any type of diversity. The way we talk about it, it's often about the problems, and I think it's really important also to think about the advantages. You get advantages when you have diversity. There's actually lots of studies about it. I work in video games. If you only have English speakers, you don't realize when you translate this to Korean that the princess character won't speak the same as the barbarian, because in English we have a pretty flat language in that regard. Whereas in a lot of Asian languages, you'll have, very feminine and masculine ways of speaking and gruff and that kind of thing. So, those perspectives and those views actually have a lot of value. And so, when you build a diverse team, I think it's one of the lessons you can bring out that really sells it is you actually get better results. And I think we should always keep that in mind.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, as a founder of a startup, we started, well, actually, ironically, as a not diverse team, because I wasn't out, right? And even my co-founder didn't know. And then, I came out, slowly, and our first hire was a woman. And, after, and as I came out and everything, we, had just a really good, foundation of we had a cis male founder, a trans woman founder, our first engineer hire was a woman, and then from there it just kind of snowballed, and we just have kept gender diversity. We're now we're only 9 people, right? So it's easier. But it's we have 4 cis men and 4 not cis men, because we have some non-binary people on staff. I am binary, but we have people who are not binary. But yeah, like it was just easier, right? Like when you get started the right way, it's so much easier. And I've spoken to people that have like companies that are like, oh, we have, we're 30 people, we're 50 people, and we still haven't hired a woman, and we don't know what to do because we really know we have to fix this problem. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you're screwed. Like,
Janitorial services for one gender bathroom.
oh, yeah, it's, so yeah, I mean, like when you get to that point, like, don't wait until you're like 20 people before you hire, a woman. Like, way too late. Like, and I've been at companies where people didn't know that I was trans, and because I wasn't out yet, and I had them correcting my pronouns because I was using they and them pronouns, but they would correct them, and we had like. We would get our first female hire, and they would, okay, everybody, we have to have a conversation, right? Like, all hands meeting, we're hiring a woman, get your shit in order. Like, you should not have to have those meetings.
Have your shit in order. Right. Okay, cool. The last one I think I would just like to add to this panel is just be unapologetically intentional. Right? So the only way you're going to create that kind of environment that you want as a leader is to be very intentional about it. And so go where the talent is. If that's different than the traditional places where you recruit, then go there where the talent is and make them aware of the opportunities you have. So just be unapologetic. We're going to take a question from this side.
It's more of a comment. As advocates and allies, we really need to watch our vocabulary. Like, using the term sausage fest is not actually cool in gender identity because there's probably people here who actually have a penis who are not men. So we need to watch ourselves using terms like tranny and sausage fest and these other things when we're talking to us and those outside. Because otherwise they're going to start using those terms for the same things because, well, you used it. So it's just something we as advocates need to be really careful of.
Great comment. Thank you for that.
I have a question as well. Sorry for my English. I'm from Israel, and I'm from Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv is a fairly open city, and I work in a very open company as well. And we do have a lot of unspecific genders around the company, and I'm managing a group that became too much open, if you know what I mean. It started as a self-inflicted laughs about the people with gays or whatever, and now it became like a group of people that laughs on each other. And I would really like to hear some advice on whether to stop it or not, whether to leave it open and that's the way to cope with the situation or whatever, or just talk about it and stop it, and then I'm stopping the openness. Sorry.
No, it's okay. You want to take it in?
I'm trying to figure out the question. I'm sorry.
Think about, it's like an insult, a group of insults, like cross-gender insults and too much of it, I think.
Oh, they become too relaxed.
Too relaxed about it, exactly.
Okay. And maybe making other people uncomfortable with the looseness of language.
Yeah, I mean... So, I mean, like, and to the previous comment as well, I mean, like, I also recognized it, and yeah, I mean, like, culture is an interesting thing, right? And culture is evolving, and culture, belongs to the people that create it. And, there's a lot of work to try and change that culture, right? And changing culture is a slow and hard thing. And, like, we have people, like, I meet a lot of cis women who, say things that are kind of sexist, right? Because, like, we internalize these and then we adopt these because they're part of a larger culture. And, like, even marginalized people make mistakes. Even marginalized people, embrace and adopt the words of oppression, right? And, like, we all contribute to this, and sometimes we contribute to things that are against ourselves or our communities, and we do it unintentionally. We do it because people around us do it and we just we don't reflect on it, or we just slip and we make a mistake or whatever, and it's hard. And it's a
Should I stop it? Should I, as a manager, go into this room and just stop it and say, listen, guys, we're not laughing at that thing. It's not funny to everybody. It's offensive.
I think it's
Yeah, I think you can.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think it also depends on the severity of it and the context of the specific conversation. But yes, you absolutely can do that, and I have done this. Right? I've had to tell people hey, you got to stop that. Right? Call out culture is something that can be controversial, but it's something that's necessary, and especially as a boss, you need to tell people this is inappropriate.
you can have a culture of inclusion and still demand a certain level of professionalism and respect.
And you can stop it without ending, you can be an open culture, you just, set a boundary, and it's, it's not an all or nothing. You can set a boundary and, this is acceptable, this isn't, and you can have a gray area, and you need to, people need to know they're in a gray area and watch themselves. I think you can do that and still have a very open, accepting culture.
And that ties into the comment you made earlier. I mean, obviously, I made that statement that was an overgeneralization, and being aware, self-aware about that. And that's one of those cases of, as you're managing people, is to be self-aware that this is, you mentioning this out, is you realize that it could potentially be a problem. One of those cases is where you really don't want to get to a point where actually you're losing your good staff or you're causing conflict. That's really, I think a lot of the times the major role is I'm finding out in management is conflict avoidance through better management of people, how people interact, not necessarily, I guess, being language police per se, but understanding the relationship between people. As you get to managers, you're doing less technical stuff, you're doing more people things. So, and also being humble enough to know hey, yeah, I stepped over the line, or ensuring that the other person's hey, this may not be cool, and kind of bring that up and say, let's kind of tone it back down. We can still be open, we can still be frank, but there's some stuff that just doesn't fly everywhere.
Yeah, thank you. So we have 3 questions, and I want to get to all of them. So I'm going to ask that one panelist take each question. So we'll start with you on this side.
So very early on in my career, I think one of the things that was said to me was my code was pretty good for a girl. So I've spent a lot of my career trying to keep my gender identity out of what I do. I would like to be known as a good programmer rather than a good female programmer. So it's kind of about celebrating being a unicorn versus not, saying unicorns don't exist. Can you guys speak a little bit to the balance of how really that can be handled?
So when we actually are up here organizing the panel, we had a similar question that was brought up. And there was an old adage from 10, 15 years ago, on the internet, no one knows if you're a dog. And that's the idea, is if you carry yourself, and not necessarily in a genderless way, but you're not really kind of trying to make it it's a her who's behind that screen name or whatever, and it's gotten that particular recently in the security community on Twitter. People have been going back and forth, and I think people should be valued, and I mentioned this before, is by the quality of what they've generated, the true level of meritocracy, and sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. But now with everything going digital, there's even some companies out there, oddly enough, one started by a trans woman, that goes through programmers' code to help with hiring, and it's based on the quality of work, not who the person is, not how they've spun their resume or anything like that. So there are people kind of trying to examine that.
Great question. Yes.
In the grand scheme of things, the gay and lesbian movement is pretty not very long. It's only been about 40 years. As a gay man with a husband and 2 kids, I've noticed a huge difference in just the past 10. So that being said, where do you think transgender lies on that? When can we see it more normalized? When do we not have to worry about it anymore?
Wow, so this is a hard one. I think one thing that is important is that a lot of the work of the, LGBT rights movement came from transgender women. Martha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, put in a lot of work with STAR and other programs to, make, to create what we have today for gay and lesbian people. We can't stop at gay marriage. We need to keep going, and we need to support trans people more. There's a lot of talk about the transgender tipping point, and that we are getting to a point where there's visibility. I mean, I feel a little bit like, like when I was, a teenager in the 90s, seeing what was happening in, the gay and lesbian communities. I feel that a little bit of today is a little bit like that. Although, I was kind of young and I wasn't, in that community exactly at that time. But it feels a little bit like that. So I feel like maybe in another 10, 15, 20 years, we'll be in a much, much better place. Hopefully sooner, but yeah, I can only guess.
So I'm definitely wanting more diversity at the company that I work for, and I guess part of that is trying to put out there like a job posting to try and attract new candidates and making that more appealing to a more diverse range of people. Are there any tips that you guys have on how to make job postings more appealing? Or maybe easier to answer, is there stuff that we can not put in that would put off people?
Yeah, the language is really telling of a culture sometimes. And there are plenty of companies and applications out there, like Text.io, I think, Unity, Unitive, that will actually help and go through and parse for specific language like Coding Ninja, or I don't know the other ones, we don't use them. But there's just a bunch that are just really male-centric and that will turn a lot of people off, or things that are, if you only talk about the perks of your company and then don't exactly talk about what type of culture you have there. And also, one of the things I love to say is that your happiest employees are your best recruiters. And so if you invest internally as well, they will talk about how great it is to work at that company. So there are, with my limited time here, I would say that there are a lot of applications that you can use, and I'm happy to share them with you. But it comes down to the way that you do your job postings, where you're actually posting them, and then how everyone feels internally.
Fantastic. Last question.
And my question's related to that. I was wondering, can companies encourage diversity in the application pool to really be able to have that diversity and hire more diverse individuals?
I think that the answer we just got was pretty good, but some big things I think are basically going back to watching your language. If you talk about benefits in 401k matching, but you don't talk about, say, I don't know, maternity leave, that can be a little bit telling. If you have profiles and it feels like, everyone's a guy except for the girl who's there to show you have a girl, that can be a problem. And so I think, if you can present your company's culture and that kind of thing, either deliberately on your what it's like to work here page, or your interactions, with the community, as it were, that can really help sell people that you're, the right place to be. I've seen a lot of work, at Amazon recently around that, where things for the gender diverse community are, clearly being paid attention to, and, I've been talking about it with friends, happy employees, as it were, and, it's kind of quote unquote spreading the word, and I think that's kind of the big key.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And yes, Amazon is hiring, in case you're interested. So we're out of time, but I want to end with just a lightning round, 30 seconds. I'm going to start with Ameline, come down the row. Just one piece of advice that either you would give to this audience as colleagues who are trying to help build inclusive work environments, or one piece of advice you would give to your younger self, knowing what you know now. And we'll take 30 seconds each and close out.
Okay, I'm going to time myself now. Okay, so I've been holding off this joke here. So we were talking about being Google for LGBTQ issues. I don't mind being Bing because no one uses Bing. So being unafraid to actually put yourself out there. If you're in a role, put yourself out there. Be willing to do it, but know where those limits are. Don't tokenize yourself because that kind of pigeonholes you and it can actually restrict your ability to kind of move elsewhere, do better things, because that's all that gets in your head. So yeah.
Mine is just simple. It's something that I would have told my younger self and something I tell anybody is to take time for yourself. This is a lot of hard work and this is emotionally tolling and this is it can take a lot out of you. And I didn't take any time for myself. I didn't take a vacation for years. I would work 80 hours a week because I really wanted to solve a problem that can't be solved overnight. And so as much as you love doing this work, as much as you care about this work, I think that, yes.
That was funny. Cool.
As much as you care about it, you do need to take time for yourself because if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to help and solve anything.
So for my younger self, I wish I could have told myself, yes, you can do this earlier, that you're not alone, and that you don't have to care what other people think, that, being yourself and your own self-care is the most important thing, and that, so a turning point for me was recognizing that I couldn't be there for other people if I wasn't there for myself, and I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't, I have children. I'm a single mom, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be there for my children because I was no longer there for myself, and so I should have learned that lesson much, much earlier. And I think other people should, you should all take time for self-care, and whether or not that's if you're trans and you need to come out, or whether or not that's you're working too many hours at work and you just need to take some time off, or whatever it is, take care of yourself.
Great advice.
I feel like we're in a theme here. So the big piece of advice I have is I was, raised in a kind of technically minded family, and it was this sort of do the proper thing, do what you're supposed to do. And I, eventually I kind of peeled that away, and I'm going to kind of present myself as who I am, not who I think I'm supposed to be to you. And the more I have done that, the more I have realized that results in me being happier, me having a better social sphere, me doing better at work. It's be yourself. Don't try and be the person you think people want you to be, because you'll never, know what they want you to be, and you won't even know who you are sometimes.